She cannot hear anyway. The words slipped across the ballroom like a cold draft through a locked door. A few guests laughed softly. Others smiled without thinking. Most simply returned to their conversations. At the far end of the room, beneath a ceiling covered in crystal chandeliers and golden light, Eleanor Grant lowered her eyes for a moment and folded her hands neatly in her lap. The annual Grant Innovations Charity Gala was supposed to be one of the most prestigious events in Chicago. Hundreds of executives, investors, politicians, and community leaders filled the grand ballroom of the Lakeshore Regency Hotel. Expensive suits moved through the crowd. Crystal glasses caught the light. A jazz quartet played softly near the stage. Everywhere people talked about influence, opportunity, and success. Yet in the middle of all that attention sat a woman who felt invisible. Eleanor had attended events like this for years. She knew the routine. People greeted her warmly. They smiled politely. They asked how she was doing. Then they remembered she was deaf. The conversation would stumble. Someone would nod awkwardly. Another person would glance toward an interpreter that was never there. Within seconds, the moment would end. Tonight was no different. A woman seated beside Eleanor tried speaking to her. Eleanor smiled kindly, but could not understand. The woman repeated herself louder, as if volume could solve everything. A few uncomfortable seconds passed. Then the woman excused herself and turned back toward another conversation. Eleanor remained alone. Across the ballroom, 25-year-old Aaliyah Brooks balanced a silver tray against one hand while moving between tables. Dressed in a professional black service uniform and apron, she blended into the background the way waitresses often did. Guests remembered the food. They remembered the decorations. They rarely remembered the people serving them. Aaliyah had learned long ago not to take it personally. Still, something about Eleanor caught her attention. Maybe it was the forced smile. Maybe it was the loneliness hidden behind it. Or maybe it was because Aaliyah recognized a feeling she had seen before. Near the center of the room, cameras flashed around Nathaniel Grant. At 42 years old, he had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Reporters surrounded him. Investors competed for a few minutes of his time. Everyone wanted something from him. Nathaniel handled the attention with practiced confidence. He shook hands, answered questions, smiled for photographs. Yet only a short distance away sat his mother, unnoticed by almost everyone. Eleanor watched her son from across the room. Pride filled her eyes. So did distance. The jazz music continued drifting through the ballroom. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Aaliyah moved from table to table until she found herself near Eleanor once more. This time she noticed something different. Eleanor was watching the room carefully, not with sadness, with patience, as if she had spent years waiting for someone to truly see her. Then another awkward interaction unfolded. A guest approached Eleanor, attempted a brief conversation, realized communication would be difficult, and quietly stepped away. The moment lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet it told Aaliyah everything she needed to know. She stopped walking. Around her, the gala continued without interruption. Nobody noticed the decision forming in her mind. Nobody expected anything unusual from a waitress carrying a tray. Aaliyah carefully placed the tray onto a nearby service station. She straightened her apron, took a slow breath, then began walking toward Eleanor Grant. The older woman looked up as Aaliyah approached. Her expression carried the same polite expectation she had shown everyone else that evening. Another greeting, another misunderstanding, another short conversation destined to disappear before it began. But Aaliyah had no intention of speaking. She stopped beside Eleanor's chair, smiled warmly, and slowly raised her hands. Aaliyah's hands moved with calm confidence. "Good evening, ma'am. It is a pleasure to meet you." For a brief moment, Eleanor simply stared at her. The sounds of the ballroom seemed to disappear behind the sudden rush of emotion crossing her face. Then her eyes widened. A smile appeared. Not the polite smile she had worn all evening. A real one. Warm. Surprised. Alive. "You know sign language?" Eleanor asked, her hands moving carefully. Aaliyah nodded. "I do." Eleanor laughed softly, a sound few people in the room could hear, but everyone nearby could see. The change was immediate. The loneliness that had surrounded her throughout the evening seemed to dissolve. Several guests turned toward the table. One executive paused in the middle of a conversation. Another lowered his glass. Something unusual was happening. Aaliyah pulled a chair slightly closer and continued signing. My grandmother was deaf. She taught me when I was very young. Eleanor's expression softened. How young? 6 years old, Aaliyah replied. Eleanor shook her head in amazement. Most people tell me they wish they could learn. Very few actually do. Aaliyah smiled. My grandmother never gave me a choice. She said if I loved her, I would learn her language. Eleanor laughed again. I like your grandmother already. Nearby guests began noticing the conversation. They could not understand the signs, but they could understand the emotions. They watched Eleanor transform from an isolated figure sitting alone into the most engaged person in the ballroom. For the first time that evening, she was not struggling to participate. She was leading the conversation. Across the room, Nathaniel Grant noticed the growing attention around his mother's table. Reporters were no longer focused entirely on him. Several guests had turned away from business discussions. Curious, he followed their gaze. What he saw stopped him in place. His mother was smiling brighter than he had seen in years. She was speaking with a young waitress. Or rather, she was communicating with her in a language most people around them did not understand. Nathaniel frowned slightly and took a few steps closer. At the table, Eleanor continued signing. Tell me about your grandmother. Aaliyah's eyes brightened immediately. Her name was Rose Brooks. She taught me patience. She taught me kindness. She taught me that being understood is one of the greatest gifts you can give another person. Eleanor nodded slowly. Wise woman. Very wise. Around them, more people quietly gathered. Not enough to create a scene. Just enough to listen. Just enough to wonder. Aaliyah noticed, but remained focused on Eleanor. Most of the world spent years talking. My grandmother spent years teaching me how to listen. Eleanor looked at her carefully. Then she signed something that made Aaliyah pause. What was it like growing up with her? Aaliyah glanced down briefly before answering. It was wonderful, but it was also difficult sometimes. I saw people ignore her. I saw people speak around her instead of to her. I saw people assume she was confused when she was often the smartest person in the room. Eleanor's smile faded slightly. She understood that experience all too well. Before she could respond, a shadow appeared beside the table. Nathaniel had arrived. He looked at his mother, then at Aaliyah, then back at his mother. For several seconds, he said nothing. He simply watched the conversation unfolding in front of him. Eleanor noticed him immediately. Her smile widened. Then she signed something quickly toward Aaliyah. Aaliyah laughed softly. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. What did she say? Eleanor smiled mischievously. Aaliyah hesitated before translating. She said this is the happiest she has been all evening. Nathaniel looked at his mother. The answer hit harder than he expected. For a moment, Nathaniel did not know how to respond. He had attended hundreds of events during his career. He had received awards, delivered keynote speeches, and negotiated deals worth millions of dollars. Yet standing beside his mother's table, a simple sentence unsettled him more than any boardroom challenge ever had. The happiest she has been all evening. He looked at Eleanor again. She was smiling warmly, her attention completely focused on Aaliyah. The expression felt familiar and distant at the same time. Nathaniel could not remember the last event where he had seen her enjoying herself so naturally. Around them, guests continued watching with quiet curiosity. The ballroom remained elegant and lively, but a different kind of energy had begun spreading through the room. People sensed that something meaningful was unfolding. Eleanor signed another question toward Aaliyah. Do you still use sign language every day? Aaliyah nodded immediately. Every chance I get. Eleanor's eyes brightened. That answer pleased her. Most people forget what they do not use, she sighed. Aaliyah smiled. I could never forget. It feels like part of who I am. Eleanor laughed softly and signed another sentence. That is exactly how language should feel. Nathaniel watched their hands move effortlessly. He recognized only a few signs. Years ago, he had promised himself he would learn more. He had even purchased books and enrolled in an online course. But there had always been another meeting, another deadline, another reason to postpone it. Looking back, the excuses sounded weaker than ever. One of the guests standing nearby leaned closer to Nathaniel. Do they know each other? He asked quietly. Nathaniel shook his head. Not that I know of. The guest seemed surprised. They talk like old friends. Nathaniel glanced back toward the table. The man was right. There was an ease between them that usually took years to develop. Not because they shared a history, because they shared understanding. Eleanor suddenly turned toward her son and signed something directly to him. Nathaniel stared for a second, trying to follow the movement of her hands. He caught only a few words. Aaliyah noticed and gently translated. She asked if you remember when you used to practice signs with her after school. The question unlocked a memory Nathaniel had not visited in years. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table, his mother patiently teaching him simple phrases. He remembered laughing whenever he made mistakes. He remembered promising her he would become fluent one day. A faint smile appeared on his face. I remember, he said quietly. Eleanor's expression softened. Then she signed again. Aaliyah translated. She says you learned very quickly. Nathaniel laughed once. That was a long time ago. Eleanor immediately responded with another sentence. Aaliyah smiled before translating. She says some important things are worth remembering. The words lingered between them. Nearby guests exchanged thoughtful glances. What began as curiosity was turning into reflection. Many of them were thinking about promises they had postponed, conversations they had delayed, relationships they had assumed would always have more time. Across the ballroom, the jazz quartet transitioned into a slower melody. The music drifted through the air like a memory. Nathaniel looked around the room, filled with people who admired his success. Then he looked back at his mother. For years he had worked tirelessly to give her every comfort imaginable. The finest healthcare, the safest home, every opportunity money could provide. Yet tonight a young waitress had given her something far more valuable and less. The truth settled over the table with surprising weight. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded for a moment as she watched her son process her words. Around them, conversations continued throughout the ballroom, but the small circle surrounding the table seemed separated from the rest of the event. Aaliyah remained beside them, uncertain whether she should return to work or stay. Yet something told her this moment mattered. Nathaniel finally looked up. There was no defensiveness in his expression, only reflection. For years, he had measured his success through growth charts, market share, and business milestones. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, he found himself measuring something entirely different. Eleanor noticed the change immediately. Then she signed another sentence. Her movements were gentle and unhurried. Aaliyah watched carefully before translating. She says she knows you love her. Nathaniel blinked. The answer caught him off guard. Eleanor continued signing. Aaliyah translated each thought exactly as it was given. She says she has never questioned that. She says you have always tried to take care of her. You make sure she is comfortable. You make sure she is safe. You make sure she has everything she needs. Nathaniel lowered his eyes slightly. That part was true. He had spent years making certain his mother wanted for nothing. Yet Eleanor was not finished. Her hands moved again. Aaliyah hesitated before speaking. She says sometimes people confuse taking care of someone with spending time with them. The sentence landed softly, but its impact was undeniable. Several nearby guests fell silent. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Eleanor was not criticizing her son. She was sharing a truth many people secretly feared hearing themselves. Nathaniel stared at the table for a moment. Then he laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny, because he recognized the accuracy of the observation. He remembered countless times he had called his mother while driving between meetings. Countless times he had shortened visits because another obligation was waiting. Countless times he had promised himself there would be more time later. Eleanor smiled gently when she saw recognition appear on his face. Then she signed another question. Do you remember our Sunday mornings? Nathaniel's expression softened immediately. Of course he remembered. Pancakes. Newspapers spread across the kitchen table. Long conversations that lasted for hours. Back then, there had never seemed to be a shortage of time. Aaliyah translated the question, though she suspected Nathaniel already understood enough to know what his mother meant. I remember, he answered quietly. Eleanor nodded. Then she signed something longer. Aaliyah followed every movement carefully. She says those mornings were never important because of the food. They were important because nobody was in a hurry. The room grew still once again. Aaliyah thought about her grandmother. Nathaniel thought about his childhood. Even some of the guests seemed lost in memories of their own. Eleanor continued. Her hands moved slowly now, each gesture carrying years of experience. Aaliyah translated. She says the older she gets, the more she realizes that people rarely remember accomplishments. They remember moments. They remember conversations. They remember how someone made them feel. Nathaniel looked directly at his mother. For perhaps the first time that evening, he was not distracted by reporters, investors, or responsibilities. He was fully present. Eleanor smiled when she noticed. Then she signed one final sentence. Aaliyah felt emotion rise unexpectedly as she translated. She says tonight is special because for the first time in a long time, she feels like she has her son back. The words lingered in the air between them. Nathaniel could not answer immediately. He simply looked at his mother while years of distance seemed to shrink little by little. And standing beside the table, Aaliyah realized that what began as a simple act of kindness was becoming something far greater than anyone in the ballroom had expected. For several moments, nobody at the table spoke. Nobody needed to. The emotion behind Eleanor's words lingered in the air long after Aaliyah finished translating them. Around the ballroom, the evening continued moving forward. Servers carried trays through the crowd. Guests exchanged business cards. Soft music drifted beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet for those gathered near Eleanor's table, time seemed to slow. Nathaniel remained seated beside his mother. He looked at her differently now, not as a responsibility, not as a family obligation tucked between meetings and travel schedules. He looked at her as a person whose stories he had not heard in far too long. Eleanor noticed the change immediately. Then she smiled and signed another question toward Aaliyah. How did your grandmother teach you sign language? Aaliyah's face brightened at the memory. The answer came easily. Every day, she signed. During breakfast, during errands, during walks, during ordinary moments most people would never remember. Eleanor listened closely. Aaliyah continued. She believed language should not appear only when there is a problem. She believed communication should be part of life itself. Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Nearby guests leaned closer, drawn into the conversation without realizing it. One executive who had spent most of the evening discussing investments now found himself listening more carefully than he had all night. Aaliyah smiled softly as memories returned. My grandmother used to take me to a small park every Saturday morning. We would sit on the same wooden bench. Then she would ask me questions about people walking by. Eleanor seemed intrigued. What kind of questions? Aaliyah laughed gently. She would ask what I noticed. At first I noticed obvious things. Someone jogging. Someone walking a dog. Someone carrying groceries. But that was never the answer she wanted. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with recognition. Aaliyah continued. She taught me to notice different things. Who looked lonely. Who seemed worried. Who might need kindness. Who felt invisible. The table fell silent again. Not because the story was dramatic. Because it was true. Everyone there had met invisible people. Most had simply been too busy to notice. Nathaniel listened carefully. The lesson reminded him of something his own father once said. Success often teaches people how to lead organizations. Very few things teach people how to truly see others. Eleanor signed another sentence. Your grandmother sounds extraordinary. Aaliyah smiled. The funny part is she never thought so. She worked ordinary jobs, lived in a small apartment, drove an old car. But everywhere she went, people remembered how she made them feel. Eleanor nodded slowly. That is real influence. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly. He had spent years chasing influence on a massive scale. Market influence, industry influence, public influence. Yet listening to Aaliyah speak, he realized that some of the most important forms of influence never appeared in magazines or annual reports. They lived quietly inside the lives of other people. Eleanor signed again. What would your grandmother say if she could see you tonight? The question caught Aaliyah by surprise. For a moment she laughed. Then her expression softened. Honestly, she would probably tell me to stop standing around and get back to work. The group laughed together. Even Nathaniel smiled. But after the laughter faded, Aaliyah added something else. She would also remind me that every person deserves to be seen, no matter who they are, no matter where they sit in the room. Eleanor's eyes filled with emotion. She reached out and gently squeezed Aaliyah's hand. The gesture was simple, yet everyone watching understood its meaning. It was gratitude, respect, recognition. Across the ballroom, dozens of guests continued talking, unaware that one of the most important lessons of the night was unfolding at a small table near the center of the room. And as Nathaniel watched his mother and Aaliyah share that moment, he began to understand that wealth could buy comfort, status could command attention, and success could open doors, but none of those things could replace the simple human gift of making another person feel seen. The evening continued, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom no longer resembled the event that had begun a few hours earlier. Conversations that once revolved around stock prices, market forecasts, and business opportunities had quietly shifted towards something more personal. Guests found themselves discussing family, communication, and the people they wished they spent more time with. Without realizing it, Aaliyah had changed the tone of the entire room. She had not planned to. She had simply noticed someone who seemed alone. Eleanor watched the crowd with quiet satisfaction. Then she turned toward Nathaniel and signed a short question. "Are you surprised?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "More than you know." Eleanor laughed softly. Aaliyah translated, but Nathaniel already understood enough to catch the meaning. For the first time that night, he attempted to answer with signs of his own. His movements were slow and imperfect. He forgot one word and repeated another incorrectly. Eleanor immediately laughed harder. Aaliyah could not help smiling. It was not because he made mistakes. It was because he was trying. Nathaniel noticed his mother's reaction and laughed too. "I told you I was rusty," he said. Eleanor signed something back. Aaliyah translated. "She says being rusty is better than not showing up at all." The sentence drew knowing smiles from several guests nearby. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. He knew she was talking about more than sign language. Eleanor leaned back slightly and studied her son. Then she signed another question. "When was the last time you sat with me without looking at your phone?" Nathaniel opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He genuinely did not know. The realization made him uncomfortable. Across the ballroom, the jazz quartet played another soft melody. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the room. Everything looked beautiful. Yet Nathaniel suddenly realized how many moments he had missed while chasing the next achievement. Eleanor noticed the change in his expression and softened immediately. She reached over and touched his arm. Then she signed a slower message. Aaliyah translated carefully. She says life moves fast for everyone. The important thing is noticing before it moves too far. Nathaniel looked at his mother for several seconds. Then he nodded. "I think I am finally starting to understand that." Eleanor smiled. Nearby, one of the younger executives approached the table. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I hope I am not interrupting." Everyone turned toward him. The man looked slightly embarrassed. "My younger sister is deaf. I always planned to learn sign language. I just kept putting it off." He paused before continuing. "After listening tonight, I think I am going to start." Eleanor's eyes brightened immediately. Aaliyah smiled warmly. The executive thanked them and stepped away. A few minutes later, another guest approached with a similar story. Then another. Parents, siblings, friends, people who had spent years postponing important conversations suddenly found themselves reconsidering those choices. The ripple effect continued spreading through the ballroom. Nathaniel watched it happen in real time. One small act of kindness had inspired dozens of people to reflect on their own lives. The impact was impossible to ignore. Eleanor signed one final thought before the next stage presentation was scheduled to begin. Aaliyah translated slowly. She says the world changes when people stop waiting for the perfect moment and start paying attention to the moment they already have. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Meaningful silence. The kind that arrives when everyone recognizes a truth they needed to hear. And as Nathaniel looked around the ballroom, he began to realize that the most valuable lesson of the evening had never been listed on the program. It had appeared unexpectedly through a waitress who understood that being heard is important, but making someone feel seen is even more powerful. As the evening moved closer to its conclusion, the ballroom felt less like a corporate gala and more like a gathering of people rediscovering what mattered. The scheduled presentations had resumed, but many guests seemed distracted. Their attention kept drifting back toward Eleanor's table. Something important had happened there, and everyone could feel it. Aaliyah finally stepped away for a few minutes to continue her responsibilities. She checked on guests, refilled glasses, and helped coordinate service with the other staff members. Yet wherever she went, people stopped her. Some thanked her. Others shared personal stories. One woman explained that her father had lost his hearing years earlier and admitted she had never learned enough sign language to communicate comfortably with him. A young entrepreneur confessed that he had not visited his grandmother in months despite living only 20 minutes away. Again and again, the same theme emerged. People were realizing how easy it was to postpone the relationships that mattered most. Meanwhile, Nathaniel remained beside his mother. The reporters who once surrounded him had gradually moved on. For the first time all evening, he did not seem to care. He found himself watching the room through a different lens. Earlier, he had seen attendees, investors, and potential business partners. Now he saw sons, daughters, parents, and friends. He saw people carrying stories he knew nothing about. Eleanor noticed him observing the crowd. Then she signed a question. "What are you thinking about?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. This time he attempted to answer himself. His signs were still imperfect, but he worked through them carefully. "I am thinking that I have spent years building connections and somehow neglected some of the most important ones." Eleanor watched him finish and immediately understood. Pride filled her face. Not because his signs were perfect, because he was trying. Aaliyah returned just in time to witness the exchange. She smiled but said nothing. The moment belonged to them. Eleanor then signed something longer. Nathaniel struggled to follow and looked toward Aaliyah for help. She translated gently. "She says success can be wonderful, but it becomes dangerous when it convinces people they can always make time later." The words settled over the table. Nathaniel nodded slowly. He understood exactly what she meant. Throughout his career, there had always been another project, another flight, another meeting waiting just beyond the horizon. Later had become his favorite excuse. Later had quietly stolen years. Eleanor reached into her purse and removed a small photograph. The edges were slightly worn. She handed it to her son. Nathaniel looked down and immediately smiled. It was a picture taken decades earlier. A young boy sat beside his mother at a kitchen table, both of them laughing while practicing sign language. He remembered the day instantly. He remembered believing there would always be more mornings like that. Eleanor pointed to the photograph and signed a single sentence. Aaliyah translated softly. "She says this boy used to ask questions about everything." Nathaniel stared at the picture. Then Eleanor added another sentence. "She says she misses talking to him." The words struck him harder than anything he had heard all evening. Not because they were cruel, because they were honest. He looked up at his mother and saw no accusation in her eyes. Only love, only hope. Across the ballroom, guests continued talking and laughing beneath the glow of the chandeliers. But at that table, something far more significant was happening. Nathaniel was beginning to understand that his mother had never wanted more attention, more comfort, or more gifts. She simply wanted more of him. And for the first time in years, he was finally listening. The photograph remained on the table long after Eleanor lowered her hand. Nathaniel could not stop looking at it. The smiling boy in the picture seemed familiar and distant at the same time. He remembered the curiosity, the patience, the endless questions. Somewhere between building a company and building a reputation, that version of himself had quietly disappeared. Eleanor watched him carefully. Then she signed another message. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate. Aaliyah followed each sign and felt her chest tighten as she understood the meaning. Nathaniel noticed her expression immediately. "What did she say?" he asked softly. Aaliyah hesitated for only a moment before translating. "She says that tonight, this waitress has spoken to her more than you have during years of public events." The words landed gently. There was no accusation behind them. No bitterness. No anger. That was precisely what made them impossible to ignore. Around the table, the remaining guests fell silent. Even the music seemed distant. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. He wanted to disagree. He wanted to explain. He wanted to defend the endless meetings, the travel schedules, the responsibilities that consumed his days. But deep down, he knew she was right. Eleanor continued signing. Aaliyah translated carefully. "She says she never wanted more gifts. She never wanted more attention. She only wanted conversations." Nathaniel swallowed hard. Eleanor's eyes remained kind. She was not trying to punish him. She was trying to reach him. Aaliyah continued translating. "She says every year she attends these events because she is proud of you. She loves watching people celebrate your accomplishments. But sometimes she sits alone for hours surrounded by hundreds of people and wonders when she will get to spend time with her son." No one moved. No one interrupted. The honesty of the moment filled the space between them. Nathaniel looked at his mother and saw something he had overlooked for far too long. Not disappointment. Loneliness. The kind that grows quietly over years without announcing itself. Eleanor signed again. This time her hands trembled slightly with emotion. Aaliyah's voice softened as she translated. "She says that when you were little, you used to tell her everything. Every dream. Every fear. Every idea. She says she misses knowing what is happening inside your heart." Nathaniel felt something shift inside him. Business success had taught him how to manage pressure, negotiate difficult situations, and lead thousands of employees. Yet nothing had prepared him for this conversation. Because this was not about performance. It was about presence. Eleanor reached across the table and gently touched the photograph. Then she signed one final sentence. Aaliyah blinked several times before translating. She says she does not miss the billionaire. She misses her son. The words settled over the table like a truth that had been waiting years to be spoken. Nathaniel stared at the photograph again. Then he looked at his mother. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, he reached forward and took her hand. Eleanor smiled immediately. Not because every problem had been solved. Not because the lost years could suddenly return. But because for the first time in a very long time, her son was no longer listening with his ears alone. He was listening with his heart. And standing beside them, Aaliyah realized that the most important transformation of the evening was no longer happening inside the ballroom. It was happening inside a man who was finally remembering who he used to be. The evening was nearing its end when Nathaniel Grant made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Guests had begun gathering their coats. Conversations softened as people prepared to leave. The ballroom still glowed beneath the crystal chandeliers, but the energy had changed. What began as a celebration of achievement had quietly become something much more meaningful. Nathaniel stood from his chair and looked at his mother. Eleanor smiled, sensing that something was different. He squeezed her hand gently before walking toward the stage. A few guests noticed immediately. Others followed his movement a moment later. Soon the room grew quiet. Reporters raised their cameras. Executives turned their attention forward. Everyone expected a closing speech about innovation, growth, or the future of technology. Instead, Nathaniel stood beneath the spotlight and remained silent for several seconds. His eyes moved across the room before settling on a young waitress near the back of the ballroom. Aaliyah froze when she realized he was looking directly at her. Tonight, Nathaniel began, I was supposed to celebrate success. The room listened carefully. But I learned something tonight that matters far more than success. A few curious expressions appeared throughout the crowd. Nathaniel continued. Earlier this evening, I watched a young woman do something that many of us failed to do. She noticed someone. That was all. She noticed a person sitting alone and chose to make a connection. He paused and looked toward his mother. My mother has attended events like this for years. She has supported me through every stage of my life. Yet tonight, a waitress gave her something I should have given her more often. Time, attention, conversation. The ballroom became completely silent. Nathaniel glanced toward Aaliyah again. She looked overwhelmed by the attention. He smiled reassuringly before continuing. We spend so much of our lives chasing achievements that we forget relationships are achievements too. We assume there will always be more time, more opportunities, more tomorrows. Then one day we realized that what people needed most was simply our presence. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. Nathaniel stepped away from the microphone and motioned toward Aaliyah. After a moment of hesitation, she slowly approached the stage. Applause began softly. Then it spread throughout the ballroom until nearly everyone was standing. Aaliyah looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention, which somehow made the moment even more powerful. When she reached the stage, Nathaniel extended his hand. Thank you, he said. Not for speaking sign language. Not for impressing anyone. Thank you for reminding me what matters. The applause grew louder. Eleanor sat near the front with tears of happiness shining in her eyes. Then something unexpected happened. Nathaniel turned toward his mother. Slowly and carefully, using signs that were far from perfect, he communicated a short message himself. The movements were hesitant. A few signs were clumsy, but every gesture was sincere. Eleanor watched closely. Then her face brightened with joy as she understood every word. Aaliyah smiled as she translated for those nearby. He said, I am sorry I forgot to make time. I will do better. Eleanor stood from her chair and signed a response immediately. Nathaniel understood enough to answer without help this time. The ballroom erupted into applause once more. Not because his signs were flawless. Not because he was a billionaire. But because people recognized something rare. They were witnessing someone choose connection over pride. As the guests slowly departed into the cool Chicago night, many carried home a lesson they had not expected to learn. Wealth can create opportunity. Success can earn admiration. But neither can replace the simple act of making another person feel seen. And on a night designed to celebrate accomplishment, it was a waitress who reminded everyone that the most valuable language in the world is not spoken with words. It is spoken through attention, compassion, and the willingness to truly listen.